I'm here with Congressman Dan Bishop of North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. I don't envy you in some ways having to go up to Washington, but I do appreciate your service and being willing to serve constituents. And I know right now there's a lot of interest, obviously, in coronavirus and maybe bringing this to a conclusion, at least the stay-at-home orders and some of these things we see in the news that are just debilitating a lot of folks across our state. A lot of folks are in an economic crisis. I know we have a public health crisis too, but we also have an economic crisis that is just crippling to many folks. And it just hurts our heart sometimes when we see people out there struggling. And so I really wanted to ask you, you were at the rallies in Raleigh, and we just wanted to get a sense, maybe for people who haven't been present or haven't read a lot of the news, what stood out to you? What was your assessment? Sometimes they get attacked unfairly or maybe fairly at times by the media, but what was your overall assessment of this rally?
Well, I attended the rally because the Raleigh police had put a tweet out that said that protest is a non-essential activity. And that was a particularly boneheaded thing for somebody to do, but it was an opportunity to remind people that because we sort of tend to lose sight of things. The governor's stay-home order cannot trump the Constitution. And the rights that are secured to us by the First and Fifth Amendments aren't theoretical. They're at the heart of the understanding of the relationship between people and the government. And that's true even during a pandemic. So North Carolinians who demonstrate peacefully and while practicing social distancing like I did and want to reopen our society and responsibly, they're not dangerous. They are patriots. And yes, you're right. Part of the responsibility of serving in public office is to withstand attacks. So those attacks come, but that fundamental relationship, the significance of those rights, not merely as theoretical, but real and practical, is what defines this country. And so I'll take those attacks all day long and stand in the face of them. But I was proud to be there. No hesitancy at all on my part.
One of the things, I think you're right. I wonder if there's some frustration from some people, not just in North Carolina, but nationally. We see this in Michigan, Wisconsin, a bunch of other states. But with the lack of transparency, potentially from the governor, I try to always give the governor a fair shake, and I've been one of the people who said, let's wait to see what he says with these stay-at-home orders and what his plan is instead of kind of jumping the gun. But do you sense a little bit of frustration with the lack of transparency out there?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a connection between your first question and this one. I think Governor Cooper thinks that the decisions here are all his, and therefore there's no really a need to expose information or the data that he's basing it on, or precisely what his reasoning is, to public scrutiny. But he's mistaken on both counts. And I would say since he was Attorney General for 8 years or whatever it was, it might be worse than that. He may know. He's exercising. There's limit. He believes, and people have sort of, even newspapers. The great legal scholars at some of the newspaper editorial boards, and I'm speaking sarcastically, but have said that he can do this and do it for whatever period of time. That actually is incorrect. He's exercising a quarantine and isolation power that's limited by statute. It's actually not granted to him. And it can only be exercised in any case for people who are infected or reasonably believed to have been exposed to an infectious agent. So it's overbroad by just ordering every North Carolinian to stay in their home except as approved. And then it can only last for 30 days unless he goes to court to ask for court to allow it to go on. So now, nobody's challenged that as of yet, or gone out to assert those points, because I think people want to be cooperative. But it's not his sole exclusive decision what we should do. And since it's not, the right way to proceed for someone who has a proper understanding of his role would be complete transparency. And so As a congressman, as a member of Congress, as someone who's responsible for defending people's rights, in addition to attending that demonstration, I have persistently requested, not publicly, but a lot, asked for information from the governor's office and his people, and from hospital organizations that are public entities, and I've been frustrated to hit roadblocks and obfuscation from them. The models that have been used, so whatever pieces of those have leaked out into public view, have been notoriously unreliable and erratic. And to the extent, I mean, as time has gone along, they started off saying we're going to have this enormously overwhelmed healthcare resources. And as time has gone along, that appears less and less likely to be true, to the point that it seems very improbable. And yet we still don't have a complete accounting, and we still have this insistence that this goes on indefinitely and well into June, and little accountability for it. So it's a big problem, and it starts with the governors failing to understand how this should work.
That's a good point. I wanted to get back to kind of this the protests going on, and one of the things you mentioned, the Raleigh police statement. I saw that on Twitter, was very troubled by it. But I feel like, in just getting your insight as a U.S. congressman, I feel like we've lost a sense of rights in this country collectively to some degree. There's people on social media, and I know social media doesn't always represent the state or nation as a whole, but there's people kind of cheering arrests, especially when we're talking about nonviolent people out there kind of addressing their government or bringing their grievances to the government. I saw a different reaction. Governor Mike DeWine in Ohio actually passed out face masks and did some things that were more proactive. I think some of his staff at least dialogued with the protesters, if not him himself, I'm not sure. But do you feel like we're losing a sense of rights to some degree in this nation? And this whole notion of inherent rights, and that government doesn't decree rights, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely, you are correct. And, I think some people, we've gotten to the point that it's almost a marginal representation of people who subscribe to the notion of constitutional rights that are secured to all of us, and that more and more it is popularized, or people that haven't showed great hostility to folks who claim or exercise their rights. That's of grave concern. I think we're going to have an opportunity, and maybe Ray, this is something in the nature of a silver lining. I hate to say that in the context of something where it's a sort of devastation across the landscape, not only from coronavirus, but from what you're seeing, the impacts on the economy. But there may be a silver lining in the sense that we're going to come to another side of this sometime hence, might be a year or two, when we'll have the opportunity to look back. And if it should turn out to be the case that there was a governmental reaction with a few people deciding, with very limited exposure of their thinking or the underlying data, that few people decided, and the critics out in the public insisted that those few people decide, and anybody who resists or second guesses that it should be subject to public condemnation, we may have an opportunity to reevaluate whether that's the way things should work. If indeed it appears that we have an economic devastation the likes of the world has never seen for a functioning, an extraordinarily successful economy, not only in the United States, but globally, but certainly in the United States.
Right.
And that all was crushed in response to something that turns out not to have warranted it. It may be precisely because very few people were making decisions, and limited independent judgment by the people that, in our system, the way it's designed, is those rights secure to the people, the ability to make their own judgments, and government has very limited control over people. So well, I want to make sure that's clear. It's subject to the laws. Now, the laws can be passed, but you can't just have a government official come in and start controlling people according to his whim.
Right.
And so I'm afraid, that we may have an opportunity to refresh that spirit in the United States and elsewhere by having this thing play out.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I feel like, people even forget that government is really the servant of the people, and they're not masters over anybody, and that's so, I think, just pinnacle and important to our whole view and just destiny of self-government, right? I mean, that's critical.
I think that's right. And if I could add one other point that you just made, you triggered for me. I think that what you're seeing in the United States Congress right now, consider this. We've been gone from the Congress since early March, mid-March at least, and that we're now right at the end of April, beginning of May. And there was a plan to go back next week, and then the House physician or congressional, the attending physician with Congress, apparently made a statement, I think literally was okay, which said we shouldn't restore normal operations until there's a vaccine.
Right.
But it was portrayed in the way it came out in the article. It was that maybe we shouldn't return. So consider that. It talked about servant of the people. That's exactly right. And soldiers take risks every day to serve the nation. Congress needs to be back in Washington.
Yeah.
You got to consider how exceptional this is. In the Civil War in 1861, with the Confederate Army just outside Washington, the Congress stayed in session and passed 67 major laws. After 9/11, they didn't miss a day because of the significance to the country of the people's representatives being assembled to govern. Now, these folks now are planning for an indefinite time, the Democratic leadership of Congress, to keep the House out of session. And then they're also talking about fundamentally changing the way we work. So we're working by remote control, trying to do committee hearings by Zoom conference. It's just, even if it can be done technically, it's a very challenging thing. And it all is because people have lost their sense of duty and the notion and the right relationship between government, which serves people.
That's such an important point. I've been following, I followed him for a long time, but Congressman Thomas Massey has brought up a lot of those points I felt on Twitter, and I've agreed with them. And I'm just glad to see you talking about that as well, because you're right. I mean, you have to take a certain amount of risk if you're elected to a position, and I think just serve people. That's what you're elected to do, and I think that's an important notion. And I do want to get back to this issue of local control, because I think it's an important one. I'm trying to write a little bit about it on now. But can North Carolina do more instead of trying to manage this crisis from Raleigh? I feel like one of the things that has frustrated me a little bit with Governor Cooper, is he's tried to just micromanage a little bit of this too much. I saw there's some pushback from county commissioners and different folks in different counties. Obviously, the situation's different in certain parts of the state. So can that be done?
Well, what you see, and you've seen it done sort of haltingly and maybe a little bit ham-handedly in a couple of cases, but the instinct that is there is a sound one. That when there is governmental control to the greatest extent possible, it usually is best exercised closer to the people. So principles subsidiarity that you go from the federal government down to state government should do more when they can, and then the locals. And in this case, we have enormous differences of circumstance between Mecklenburg County or Wake County, the other urban counties, and many rural counties where the outbreak is quite limited. Even the number, remember this, even though if you see cases in most counties, most cases of coronavirus don't turn out to be something that is severe, that requires hospitalization, and certainly not something that threatens life. Some vulnerable people, that's not true. But so it makes sense that people who are on the ground in those counties, to the extent they've got legitimate power to exercise, ought to be the ones making those calls. And in fact, I made reference earlier to, and it's not been talked about very much. I don't think I've even not been saying anything in public about it yet, although I might say more in the future. But the notion of what the quarantine and isolation power is, it is, if you study that statute, it's something that is not contemplated to be exercised on the state at the state level as a whole.
Yeah.
County by county. Now, a state official can do it, but even so, they've got to, after 30 days, they've got to go into court in the county affected and persuade a court to allow them to continue. And that hasn't happened. So the people who are at local level saying the governor's way over his skis are exactly right.
That's a good point. I was recently at Lowe's. I'm not picking at Lowe's, this is just where I was, but there was just people everywhere in Johnson County. It's wall to wall. And it makes sense because there's a lot of home improvement projects going on with more people being at home. But it occurred to me, and I'm not the first to think this, but why can't small businesses be trusted more to implement, these measures, safety measures and public health measures to keep their stores, retail outlets clean? It feels like in some ways, mom and pop businesses are getting the short end of the stick here, at least to some degree, in my own observations. And you can tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's right. And these the injustices that occur by this sort of wholesale disregard of the way rights function in the country, you start seeing these images that are very striking. The one that pops into my mind was a hair care barber or hairdresser, whatever she was, who had decided to return to, and the chief of police, I think, came to visit her, did it in a fairly nice way. It was in Roxborough, and told, coerced her to stay shut down. I believe merchants, and consistent with everything else that I've said, we don't have unquestioned answering to whimsical power in this country. And it's not the way the system's supposed to work. So if you have, I think both business operators and ultimately individuals, there will be exceptions of people who use poor judgment. But on the whole, it's perfectly viable. And you mentioned Lowe's, and somebody goes to a Lowe's or any other store and they drive into the parking lot and they see an enormous number of cars, or they walk in the front door and they see tons of people with no organized or limited numbers, or people crowded up in there. There's something that's very simple and reasonable and responsible, and that is they can turn around and go get back in their car and go home. Every one of us has both the right and the responsibility to contribute to keeping North Carolina one of those states that has a very on the lower end of this crisis, and moving us in the right direction. So I don't think that. I mean, it works better. It will always work better than having a government do things with top-down rules. Then you don't see a lot of compliance, because you get lower and lower, people have come to believe it's not really in their hands or subject to their control, and they yield responsibility even as they yield their rights. Those two go together in every respect, and I think the best way to resolve this be get everybody in the game, have everybody's participation, give the information to everybody, and use your governor's power as a bully pulpit to encourage and exhort people to rise to the challenge, rather than infantilize them, tell them to be locked in their homes, and don't come out until the government says it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Getting back to this notion of self-government, I mean, it's hard to do that in the U.S. because we do still have, even though we have a lot of problems in this area, we still have this strong notion and sense of self-government and self-rule. And, I just hope that continues, even through a crisis. That's so important. I wanted to ask you one final question, and it has to do with just the overall notion of Congress. Most people have a low view of Congress. We won't just completely blame you, Congressman Bishop. I think you've only been there about a year. But what has been the biggest failure in relation to coronavirus for this U.S. House, the response to coronavirus? In what ways are they succeeding, if any?
So let me first say that not a year. I've been there 7.5 months.
Okay. It seems
and
like
what a remarkable
longer, but okay.
Think about the 7.5 months, your first 7.5 months in Congress. Pretty remarkable. Within 90 days, I was voting on sham, ridiculous articles of impeachment for a president. And of course, that circus continued well into first few days of February, with the United States Senate consumed by that, and of course all the attention focused there. And at that point, the House was, all the managers over there, the House was doing nothing as that sideshow continued. And when the government should have been vigilant about what China was doing, or or not doing, to try to get around the fact that China was not disclosing, that was going on. And again, that's my first 90 days in Congress, and then immediately this crisis is full blown. And so, for the last month and a half of my tenure, we haven't darkened the door. Well, I went up there to vote. Actually, a lot of members didn't go back to vote on the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, and we only had a voice vote in the House. And then for this latest supplementation of the Paycheck Protection Program, we added another $500 billion in spending in that package, and many members didn't show up for that. And I'm not unsympathetic to the risks, or if someone were actually ill, you'd see that. But I mean, a lot of people just say, I'm afraid, therefore I'm not going. And again, as we discussed, I think that's inconsistent with our duty. So I would say, what a remarkable and troubling 7.5 months. And we're not out of it yet. It maybe to continue what you said about a lot of people having a low view of Congress, a couple other things here. In the midst, no matter how bad things are, in the midst of this horrendous, unprecedented crisis, Democrats have continued to prize a partisan agenda over the pandemic response. So after the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, and that money went really fast for small business, and the president said we needed to put more in, and everybody basically agreed with that, except Democrats held it up for 2 weeks, waited for it to run out, leaving a bunch of uncertainty in the wake, so that they could, as leverage. One of their members said, leverage. Who in the heck uses this opportunity as leverage to extract something political? And of course, in the CARES Act itself, they got their funding for the Kennedy Center, and they wanted to do the Green New Deal in the midst of, it's just, it's astonishing. I'm not naive about politics, but this is a new low, no doubt about it. And I would say that the leadership of the House, the Democratic leadership of the House, is not fit to govern. It's that simple. And then, of course, what we've already talked about a little bit, continuing to deny Americans their representation in Congress by keeping things shut down up there with nobody there. I wish I could say that I had something to balance that out, say that the view of Congress is unwarrantedly low, but I'm afraid it's correct. And when things like that happen, when things are out of balance, Americans' duty is to take the steps that are necessary to restore the right way of looking at it. And that's what I'm going to keep working to do.
Promise. Last question. You introduced a bill on certificate of need. Civitas has been working for this for years, maybe decades. I don't know. But tell me why that's important and why it would help North Carolina.
Well, and you and I haven't known each other, but we've been working arm in arm on that, in effect, for a long time. The certificate of need law, for those who don't know, is a state law. North Carolina has the fourth most restrictive in the nation, that says that healthcare, hospitals, lots of other types of healthcare facilities can't be established unless government gives a permission. So unlike anybody else who can invest their capital in a business activity, medical providers can't do that unless the government says it's okay. And the idea is they wanted to say, well, we don't want these things to be overbuilt because they'll consume too much in the way of resources. The federal government had such a law, and I think it was repealed in 84, 87, maybe one of those 2 years, I forget which. But the federal government recognized, and the Federal Trade Commission has long asserted, that it's anti-competitive, and it ends up making both fewer medical facilities available, and it keeps costs propped up, so that it keeps people from having affordable health care. It is the most absurd policy. And so when I was a freshman in the North Carolina General Assembly in the House in 2014, I introduced a complete repeal bill for CON then. Understand, the hospital systems, they fiercely hold on to that. Why? Because every monopolist or what they call oligopolist, just a few people dominating a market, have always sought to protect that situation. And it's always bad for consumers in every respect. So that should be repealed. You guys have been right about that forever. And I've worked on it at the state level. And so the bill that I filed, because amazingly during this pandemic, there actually is a little section that's embedded in the Medicare law, the Social Security Act that runs Medicare, that sort of tends to help preserve state CON laws. And so my bill says we're going to suspend that, needs to be repealed during the pandemic. And we also are going to see to it, as a matter of federal regulation of interstate commerce is appropriate, that enables or encourages states to suspend their respective CON laws, those who have them. But we really need to get rid of that. And that is just one step to the right fix for healthcare in this country, which is to use our markets, use competition. If we could, and there's so many ways like that it has been stunted and broken by government action. We could restore that, and we could provide affordable healthcare much better than a government-dominated system ever can.
That's Congressman Dan Bishop from North Carolina. I really appreciate your time. You got a lot of work to do, not only on this coronavirus fallout, but also I keep pulling up the debt clock to remind us of the failure of Washington. So I know you have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate you serving the state and this nation in Congress. So thank you.
That debt clock's going to go a lot higher, Ray.
It's depressing. It's depressing, Congressman.
Depressing and frightening, but we're going to keep going, and you can't give up because the country's at stake, and there's a good, strong foundation that will restore if we keep working at it. So thanks for what Civitas does. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you, Ray.
Appreciate it. Thank you.